to begin a new one, do we need this? Should I do this?
Yeah.
Hello?
You have to turn it on if you...
Oh, yeah. Sort of an IT crowd problem there, right? Okay. Maybe. Oh, yeah. Now you can hear me. So, to begin a new sentence, though, what it's broadly about is the way that especially visual mass culture in the 1840s and 50s changes the way that literary authors conceive of their form as either a way of thinking or as a kind of artifice. And that involves overturning some cliches about the way we think of the visual in literature. And in particular, I kind of want us to stop using substantives like the visual and instead talk about things like outline, foreshortening, photography, paint, as they are sort of broken down into their technical means. Since, I don't know, I like substantives as much as the next guy, but it seems like there's a kind of abstraction there that has made us more iconophobic than the iconophobic romantics who have this sort of vexed relationship with pictures.
I have a question for Martin Norris. So you were looking at nominal concord and subject verb agreement as two things that are different but perhaps look similar, and I just wondered about the combination of Icelandic and Estonian. Do you ever have the same problem there? Why those two languages? Are they different and similar?
So my interest in Concord first grew out of working on Icelandic, which has quite a rich system of Concord. I mean, English has it to a very reduced degree. Only demonstratives and the article versus some agree in number with their head noun. But in Icelandic, you have quantifiers, numerals, adjectives, demonstratives, possessors. I mean, basically everything has to show these features of number. We're all maybe familiar with grammatical gender, and if you've ever studied Latin or German, grammatical case, all these three features. And so that kind of started the interest first, and as it turns out, basically nobody has written about nominal concord within theoretical linguistics, even though it's a very well-known phenomenon. And then Estonian came in mostly for professional reasons. I needed to sort of diversify myself because Icelandic is actually quite popular within generative syntax. And so I picked Estonian, sort of an informed random decision, and it turns out that Estonian also has quite a rich system of concord, which is similar to Icelandic, but also different in ways that kind of makes it interesting. And so those two things I focus just looking on those two as sort of a way of, I need to narrow my scope, my scope in some way so that I can actually make some headway. But it turns out they both have very complicated systems, so that's why those two, yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Damon. I was wondering how you define sex, and how do you sort of come to terms with the sexiness of Barbarella and the sort of real intercourse standard way of thinking about sex, in the context of feminist activism or gay and liberal rights. And also I'm wondering if you talk at all about sex in terms of the abject, and sort of the more quote-unquote unattractive, and potentially sort of revolutionary in that unattractiveness, dimensions of sex as, interwoven or parallel to your...
Thanks. Yes, I kind of put all kinds of things together and threw them together in that presentation, which are quite distinct, as you say. So Barbarella belongs to a kind of earlier moment, and a discourse of sexual revolution that is kind of pre-feminist. And in my interest in that film is about the way, I don't think it's a feminist film at all. In spite of being about women's sexuality, it's not really about women's sexuality. It's like a male fantasy about women's sexuality. But it does connect pleasure as a property of the universal subject to a vision of a kind of smoothly functioning liberal democracy. Quite explicitly in the film, it's like a universalized liberal democracy. So I use it to exemplify a new kind of liberal discourse on sex. But then feminism emerges as a strong critique of that discourse. And I think that's more what you're referring to with the kind of intercourse model where sex becomes a problem within liberal terms like universality and equality. And the abject and the abject is revolutionary. I mean, all those kind of unsavory dimensions of sexuality that might get taken up by feminism, but also in a lot of other aesthetic traditions, especially French. I do have a lot of stuff. I mean, I look at that, I think that's super interesting, and fits into the kind of dystopian strand that I put in a kind of Sardian lineage, but which I could say more about, but I won't.
Well, that was my question, how sadomasochism fits into a notion of sex as staging and an allegory about liberal democracy and autonomy.
Interestingly enough, in the film the last image was from a film called Short Bus, which incorporates an aesthetics of sadomasochism as diversity, as kind of like any sexual practice that produces pleasure is equal to any other. So there is a way in which liberalism co-opts sadomasochism, or sadomasochism becomes a way of allegorizing the kind of liberal equality of pleasure, even as sadomasochism, from another perspective, is like a staging of inequality. Yeah, I think it does both things.
So my question is also for Damon, and I'm sure you draw the title from the Oceanus film.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm sort of wondering about the logic that you choose to put French and American post-1960 films. So to what extent a different kind of grouping might, contribute to a theme, sort of reconfigure the themes?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I would love to have, I don't talk about Oshima in spite of having borrowed his title, and I would like to expand it more. But I chose France and America, one, just to narrow it down, but two, because I'm interested in the parallel traditions of the kind of Declaration of Independence in the American Constitution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the French kind of Republican tradition. I think they're not, they're intersecting in parallel, but because there's so much sex in cinema from France and America, and there are these two versions of the liberal Republican tradition. It seemed like a coherent limitation of the geographical horizon. But it would be super interesting to think about Japan and Asia, and I mean, there are many non-liberal sites in which sex becomes public as well.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting not just for the sake of diversity or for the sake of the scope, but also in terms of the thematic concern that people have raised questions on sadomasochism, which in the realm of sense is precisely not about diversity, it is about diversity, right? And
absolutely, yeah.
Kind of how do you read that film when the film really ends in this very disturbing, dystopic kind of note when she dismembers him, and then he walks away with his whole accidency on the face, right?
Yeah.
So is that pre-feminist, proto-feminist?
I don't think it's pre-feminist. I mean, it's informed by feminism in some sense. Also, in terms of its date, it's like 76, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. That film is super interesting, and more interesting than the kind of liberal Barbarella tradition that I'm talking about. I guess for me, it fits into the second category of dystopian films where sex becomes a form of relationality that's incompatible with liberalism. Yeah.
I have a question for Daniel. I was wondering if you deal at all with Carmen Figuratum, or if the image of and the shape of the text at all figures into your discussion.
Could you say the influence again? What do I deal at all with blank?
With Carmen Figurata, the placement of text to resemble a picture.
Well,
I didn't turn.
Oh, I turned it off. The short answer is no. That I don't really deal with typesetting, largely because the authors that I'm working with don't really have control over their own typesetting. Although I can see that being an extension of this kind of work, especially in the case of somebody like William Blake, where there is absolute control both over the sort of illustration and over the kind of engraved script, and especially where his kind of pictograms in the margins will have this kind of calligraphic posture even when they aren't recognizably the forms of letters. So, and you know, I can see that also leading to a kind of discourse about romanticism, where the relation between word and image, instead of being well defined, is sort of dialectical and unstable, both through people like Blake and through the sort of contemporary fascination with, you know, hieroglyphics, which, you know, America is full of poets who are also amateur Egyptologists. You know, you have, I mean, Poe and Whitman are the ones who come to mind, but I'm sure we could find a lot of other scribbling members of the Champollion fan club in their ranks.
Any further? Paul?
Yeah, just another question for Daniel. You were talking about subordinating the relationship between the visual and the verbal to questions of technique, right? And so that relates to those outlines of Flaxman's engravings, which have a hieroglyphic quality or an emblematic quality. Could you talk a little bit more about, I mean, how that example introduces or allows you to think about the questions of the outline versus the verbal, or however you want to frame the visual?
Yeah, thanks. There is, you know, not unsurprisingly, a big, weird contemporary discourse about outline that will begin with things as simple as, you know, Immanuel Kant saying, okay, when we look at the plastic arts, you know, sculpture, painting, even gardening, he says, insofar as it is a fine art, you know, it's one of those snotty moments in philosophy. Then again, I probably scorn gardeners more than I should too. But, you know, he says that what you're interested in is not the whole thing, it's the outline, it's the design, which you appreciate as form, where the color merely adds appeal to your senses. So there's this inherited distinction between the outline as standing in for form, where, you know, color and content will stand in, you know, as this other material, lesser, purely sensory dimension of the picture. So in some way you've differentiated between these sort of abstract and almost language-like thoughts and mere visual surfaces within the scope of an image. So it's this kind of contradictory way of reinstantiating the verbal-visual split inside of the visual arts. And you'll see that kind of distinction kind of picked up and manipulated by peers of the British Romantics, but then also inherited by kind of authors of the so-called American Renaissance. So there's a contemporary, you know, there's William Blake's famous statement that the bounding line is what gives art value, and really, in his way of thinking, what makes things real is the distinctions between them, kind of cognitively or imaginatively, versus someone like his peer, George Cumberland, who writes a thoroughly pompous and insufferable book called Thoughts on Outline. It's really cool. You should look at it. It's online. Blake does some of the engravings for it, where he insists that by having an outline that never varies in thickness and that surrounds the figure but somehow fades into the background, he also says that the first printing in any batch is not the preferable one because the outline is too sharp and detaches the figure from the ground. But it's this obsession with imitating a form perfectly by virtue of having the line define its area without actually being aestheticized itself. So I feel like I've lost hold of your question, so I'll stop. But there is sort of massive interest in defining things like outline and using them to make distinctions between the sort of intellectual and the sensory features of images.
And with that, I suppose it's time to move on to the next panel. Thank you.